All right, we are in John, and we're in John chapter 4, and we're going to talk a little bit about Samaria this morning so we kind of understand what's going on a little bit here. The woman at the well is not something that any of the other gospel writers talk about. It's only in John's gospel, so it's kind of an interesting dialogue. We use it a lot, speaking about Jesus, his compassion, his ability to reach out to people, and I think that it is a powerful, powerful story, but it's more powerful because of where it is. Samaria was between Jerusalem and Galilee, or Judea, and that's kind of we always talk about Jerusalem, but it's really Judea. It's that little area. It's not big, and you hear it on the news all the time now. Gaza Strip, West Bank, that's all Judea. That's all that area of the world. So you're familiar with it, even if you're not. A lot of turmoil there now. But if you really look at it, it's from the Sea of Galilee, which is up here. And in John's Gospel, at the end of John, it's going to see the Sea of Tiberias, same thing. And then the Jordan River flows down to the Dead Sea. And if you know the story of the Dead Sea, it's the Dead Sea. Nothing flows out. Everything flows in. It's below sea level. It's salty. You can't sink, they say. Never tried that, never been there. But they say if you get in it, you won't sink because there's so much salt in the water. It's so dense that you literally can't sink. So Clyde's probably been there. You been there, Clyde? Gary and Donna might have been there. I've never been there. You ever been there? Can you sink? Did you get in? Huh? Taste something. Yeah. So anyway, it's the Dead Sea, aptly named. And in the middle of that area from there, because if you look at Judea, which this is Judea, and that's what we talk about, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, we're all familiar with these. The Gaza, Gaza Strip, you hear about that now, Gaza Strip, West Bank. That's west, that way is west, if you look at the little thing. So West Bank of Jerusalem is on the west side. And then if you look up here, that's Galilee. That's where Jesus was raised. That's Nazareth. That's where Jesus grew up. That's where all of his apostles but one are from Galilee. They were fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. That's what they were. That was most of their occupations. It was separated. It was different dialect. That's how come they knew they were Galileans when they spoke in Judea, because they knew by how they spoke, by their mannerisms, by, like you would know, we're from the South. Whenever I go back to see people in Colorado, they're like, look at your accent. That's so cute. I'm like, I ain't got no accent. They say, yes, you do. Anyway, but they always know I'm from down here. So because we have an accent in the same way. So they know they're Galileans, and they know they're uneducated, and they know they're fishermen, and that's that part of the world, right? Jesus did the Sermon on the Mount from Galilee. So when he talked to those people, it was really fitting for them. But in the middle of those two places is Samaria. Samaria is this landmass between Galilee and Judea. And biblically, Samaria, or that area of the world, is really important. It was part of what God gave to the Israelites. It was a land beyond the Jordan. It was part of the promise made to Abraham. It was possessed by the Israelites and those we call the northern tribes, okay? The 10 northern tribes, we call them. And it's also significant because there's a town in the middle of Samaria called Shechem, or Sychar. Sometimes you hear that word in the Old Testament. In the town of Shechem, which is right here, actually, it is really significant in biblical history for a lot of reasons. One is when the spies went across, that's where they went, but also when the Israelites crossed the Jordan, they crossed at Shechem, okay? And when you cross at Shechem, there's two mountains, and I'll show you those, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And when the Israelites crossed over into the Promised Land, they went between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and there was priests on Gerizim, and there was priests on Ebal. And as the Israelites crossed over, one group of priests gave the curses. If you don't follow God, if you don't do what God says, the other group of priests gave the blessings. If you do what God does, if you do what God commands. And so the Israelites, as they passed through these two mountains, Gerizim and Ebal, they heard that. Now the other thing that's significant here is that's where Joseph's buried. You know, it's kind of my joke, right? I love to think, you know, the guys that carried poor Joseph in the wilderness for 40 years, right? And that had to have been a drag. I mean, every morning you got up, we're moving. We got to, you know, grab Joseph, right? Grab Joseph. It's kind of my thing because, you know, they carried Joseph out of Egypt, Joseph in a sarcophagus. Joseph says, carry me back to Israel, which all was good. But when they got to the Jordan and they didn't do what God said you're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. So for 40 years, somebody carried Joseph, poor old dead Joseph. And that's always been something I've always thought about. What about them poor guys that had to carry Joseph every day? What a job, right? Get up in the morning. Well, let's get Joseph, right? So what's the first thing you do when you get to the promised land? You're going to bury him, right? Because you've carried him for 40 years in the wilderness. So Joseph's buried at Shechem. Okay, the other thing that's significant about Shechem is that's where Jacob's well is. Jacob's well's in Shechem. So Sychar or Shechem in the Bible is a very significant biblical town, and it's in the middle of Samaria. Now, what happened? Why do we call them Samaritans, right? They were Israelites. That was part of Israel. It was the northern tribes of Israel. And, of course, the tribe of Judah, okay, it was in Judea, and that was the tribe that Jesus came from, right? Came from the lineage of David, right? The tribe of Judah. So it was preserved, but all the other 10 tribes, because there was 12 tribes, right? 12 tribes of Israel, to put it really simply. All those other 12 tribes, they inherited all of this big land mass up here. Basically, all of this, even out here, okay, Ephraim was out here, some of Ephraim. All of this land mass was all the way down into here at the time of Solomon. All that was Israel. It was all God's promised land. It was all Israel. Everybody dwelt there. But what happened and this is kind of an aerial view of this. And there's an altar on Ebal. Joshua's altar's on Ebal, okay? And then there's Gerizim over there. And so when the Israelites crossed through this valley, I'm from Colorado, so when they say mountains, this more like hills to me. But they crossed into this valley between these two mountains, between these two hills, and the priests on each side would shout, "Blessed." They buried Joseph. Jacob's well's here. This is where they crossed over into the promised land. And so they did that. Here it is. Very insignificant looking to me, but I've never been there, but there it is. And but it's very, biblically, it's a very important town, Shechem. So what happened is what we call the northern tribes, which is the 10 tribes, they, of course, defied God, and God was going to punish them, and God was going to carry them off, and God warned them about that. And if you read 1st and 2nd Kings, that's God warning them. Elijah, are northern kingdom prophets. They were saying, if you don't straighten up, you don't do what God's going to do, God's going to punish you, God's going to, things are going to happen. And so the Assyrians at about 520 BC, so it's a little bit before the Babylonians took Judah, the Assyrians swoop in, right? And they capture and carry away the 10 tribes. Now, the Assyrians were assimilators, okay, like the Babylonians. And what I mean by that is that the Assyrians wanted to take all the smart people and all the wealth and all the things they could find, and they wanted to carry them back to their homeland. They wanted to make people into Samaritans or into Assyrians. They wanted to influence them with their gods and their culture, and they wanted to assimilate their nation. So the Assyrians were assimilators. Not all nations were assimilators, okay? When the Babylonians took Judah, the Babylonians were assimilators. They wanted to make the Jews, Babylonians. And if you read the book of Daniel, that's what that's about, right? Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel, they gave them Babylonian names, right? It's not Mishnah and the Hebrew names. They give them Babylonian food. They tried to make them Babylonians because they was assimilating them. But when the Medes came in and took over Babylon, the Medes weren't an assimilating culture. They weren't an assimilating kingdom. So when the Medes came in, the Medes said to the Jews, or every other nation that the Babylonians had captured, they said, listen, if you want to go home, go home. We don't care. Go home. So they weren't assimilators. But the Assyrians were. And so when they took over Samaria, that's what they did. And they brought in their gods and their culture. And if you read 2 Kings 17, the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, from Cutah, from Ava, from Hamath, and Seraphim, and settled them in the cities of Samaria, in place of the sons of Israel. So they possessed Samaria and lived in its cities. At the beginning of the living there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So they spoke to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations whom you have carried away into exile in the cities of Samaria do not know the custom of the God of the land. So he has sent lions among them. Behold, they killed them because they did not know the custom of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria commanded, saying, take there one of the priests whom you carried away into exile, and let him go and live there, and let him teach them the custom of the God of the land. So when they went in, one of the groups they carried off was the priests, because in those days priests were venerated and considered important. So they carried all the priests off. So the Assyrians move in. God sends in lions to kill all these people, which is kind of interesting, right? And so he sends in lions to kill these people. And they say, listen, we need to know the God of the land, which would have been our God, right? Which would have been God. And so the king of Assyria said, well, send back a priest and teach him. So the priest comes back, and he's teaching them about God, Yahweh, right? But what happens is what often happens is the religion gets mixed together, you see, intertwined. So now you've got this pagan gods, you got these gods of the Babylonians and the gods of the Assyrians and all these other gods, and you've got them gods there, and then you've got God there. And so this religion gets mixed together, you see. And so all of a sudden now, even though they're still Jews, technically they're Jews, technically a lot of them are still descendants of Israel, they're part of the tribes of Israel, their religion gets mixed up, okay? It's intertwined together. And because of that, the Jews consider them unclean, half-breeds. So the Jews don't want anything to do with them. And the Assyrians really don't want anything to do with the Jews, because that rift happened a long time ago when the tribes of Israel separated. So that kind of gives you the history. And 2 Kings says, the covenant I've made with you should not forget, nor shall you fear other gods, but the Lord your God you shall fear, and he will deliver you from the hand of all your enemies. However, they did not listen, but did according to the earlier custom. So while these nations feared the Lord, they also served their idols. Their children likewise, and their grandchildren, as their fathers did, so they do to this day. So 2 Kings says, listen, so they had that, but they also had idols. And so guess what? Now we got this mixed together deal. The Jews say, well, you're unclean because you're Samaritans. In Luke 10:37, he said, one who showed mercy toward him. And that's the parable of the Good Samaritan. Luke 10, parable of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus used the Samaritans as an example, right? The man was taken over by robbers and laid on the side of the road, and the priest passed him, wouldn't help him, and the scribe passed him, wouldn't help him. But there was a man from Samaria. The man from Samaria took him to the end and paid for him to be taken care of and took care of him. And Jesus posed the question, who was the man's neighbor? And he said the one who took care of him, which was a Samaritan, but he wouldn't even call him a Samaritan. He just said the one who took care of him, because I hated Samaritans. Okay? The hated Samaritans. The Jews hated Samaritans, and the Samaritans hated Jews. So what would happen is when the Jews who were in Galilee needed to go to Jerusalem to do their sacrifice, to do the things needed at the temple, they hated the Samaritans so bad that what they would do is, instead of going through here, okay, The Jews hated them so bad, the Jews would go by the way of the wilderness. They would cross over the Jordan. They would come down by the way of the wilderness. They would cross back and go into Judea. They wouldn't go through Samaria because they hated him. So for Jesus to be in Samaria in itself was essentially kind of out of the ordinary as a Jew. I hope this is starting to give you some background into what's really going on here. And so, in Luke chapter 9, it says, when the days were approaching for his ascension, he was determined to go to Jerusalem. He sent messengers on ahead of him, and they went and entered a village of the Samaritans. So once again, this is a later date, this is a later time, but he's going through Samaria, and they did not receive him because he was traveling toward Jerusalem. I brought this passage up to show you how much they hated them, right? They wouldn't receive him because he was going to Jerusalem. They hated him. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, which we call the sons of thunder, probably because of this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? But he turned and rebuked them and said, you do not know what kind of spirit you are of. It kind of shows you a little bit of the hate between these two groups of people, how much they hated one another. They wanted to send fire down and consume them. So it kind of sets the stage for what's going on here. In Luke 17, when Jesus healed the 10 lepers Jesus healed. One of them was a Samaritan, and he's the only one that came back, and Jesus even referred to him as a foreigner. Jesus said, was no one found who returned to give glory to God except this foreigner, he called him, the Samaritan. So he even referred to him as a foreigner. So it kind of gives you an idea of how much they hated one another. So hopefully that gives you a little background. Because we always talk about the Samaritans, what they were. This kind of gives you an idea of the rift between the Samaritans and the Jews. Or, I guess that's a play on words. But anyway, so when Jesus is here, so Jesus goes to Shechem, right? We're pretty sure that's where this took place. Jacob's well. Jacob's well in Shechem. There's a lot of history behind that. And he went through Samaria, didn't he? Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, and it's only in John we get this parenthetical, so to speak, statement. Although Jesus himself was not baptizing, his disciples were. He left Judea and went again into Galilee. So remember the map, right? He's in Judea, right? He's going back towards Galilee. So he's going north. He's going back to Galilee. And instead of going the way of the wilderness, around over the Jordan, he's going up through Samaria, right? And he came to the city of Samaria called Sychar, which is another name for Shechem, okay? Sychar. And he, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph, and that's really getting into, but that's how biblically significant this town is. It goes all the way back to Jacob and Joseph, and it goes all the way back. So this town goes back further than that. This is one place that Abraham stayed. When Abraham left the land to go to the land that God would show him, he stayed in Shechem. I mean, this town is biblically, historically poignant, right? It's full of biblical history. And he came to Sychar, and Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour of the day, which would be about 3 o'clock, about noon. So it was about noon. So it's the middle of the day, heat of the day, right? And heat of summer, like it is here, hot. Their summers are our summers. They're in the northern hemisphere, just like we are. Their summers are our summers. So it was hot. And there came a woman to Samaria to draw water. And Jesus said, give me a drink, for his disciples had gone away to buy food. So there's two really big things going on here. One is, she's a Samaritan. We've already seen this. Jews and Samaritans don't mix. It's like oil and water, right? The other issue here, she's a woman, right? She's a woman, and she's not just a woman, She's coming to a well at a time of day when nobody goes to the well. Nobody was there, right? I mean, in those days, how important is water? Well, got to have it, right? And in those days, you couldn't turn on your tap. There wasn't no taps. There wasn't no water. You had to go to the well. It's the only way you get water. Everybody had to go to the well. Wells were important. Wells were life. And some point during the day, everybody was going to go to the well. But guess what? If it's summertime in Oklahoma and it's noon, you're probably thinking, I ain't going to the well, right? Until dark, right? Maybe midnight because it's hot. So nobody's there. This tells you why would she go and nobody was there? Why would you go and why would you choose to go? Why do you choose to go someplace when no one else is there? Shame, right? You don't want to see anybody, right? She's an outcast of society. She's shamed. So she comes when there's no one there. That's when you come. If you want to go, if you're ashamed of something or you don't want somebody to see you, go when nobody's there, right? And that's exactly what she did. The parenthetic, and it's funny in the Bible because you get these we call parenthetical statements, stating some parentheses, but in the Greek there's really no such thing as a parenthesis. Wow. English is my first language. So, but translators put that in there to help us, right? The Jews don't have any dealing with the Samaritans. And we see that, we know that. But she's a woman on top of this, right? She's not only a Samaritan, she's not only a shamed Samaritan, she's a woman. And that just didn't happen, right? I think Jesus did more to liberate women than any other person in history. I really believe that. Jesus had these amazing dealings with women in a society that made women less than anything, right? And yet Jesus was the one who had these amazing dealings with Mary and Martha and the relationship he had with his mother and the women that followed him and supported him, and here the woman at the well. Jesus could always see the unseen, right? And the women in that society were the unseen. They were unseen. I mean, even today, look over there, right? What are women? How do they dress over there, right? They cover plumb up. They cover their everything, right? They're the unseen. There's no identity, is there, to them? That's that world, right? But Jesus, he sees her. So it's just an amazing story. And it causes you to pause and think about the relationship. Why was she important to Jesus? You ever ask yourself that question? People like Jesus, people that are in some sort of a public thought, public eye, most people that are in that type of a deal, they look for people that are somehow beneficial to them, right? In other words, you want somebody that has influence or power, authority, Heal the nobleman's slave, right? But this woman has no, I shouldn't use that word, but let's put it this way. Maybe this is the right way. This woman has no extrinsic value, right? In other words, there's nothing she can really do for Jesus. Right now, I'm not saying she doesn't have value, because she does. And Jesus knows that. She has intrinsic value. But there's no reason Jesus there's no benefit to him externally. The only benefit to Jesus is this woman. And that's so amazing, right? Because he's not looking for anything else. He's just looking to her. And so many times in life, even when we help people, in our minds sometimes we're thinking, how does this help me? Right? How does this help me? And Jesus, he didn't think that. He just thought, how can I help this person? And it's just such a lesson in that for us, right? That it's how can I help this person? Not what does it do for me, or what's in it for me, or how does it benefit me, or how does it make me look, or how does it make me feel, but how can I help this person? And Jesus had that ability to do it. And so when he sees this woman, he said, if you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. It's a very difficult idea. So he's using the water as an illustration. We need water to live. And it's interesting in Scripture how many times water is a salvation. We always think about baptism, and that's good. Maybe we should. But it's really interesting in Scripture how many times water is a salvation, right? I mean, let's go back a little bit. Go back a little bit. All right? Let's go back a ways. Let's go back to Genesis. Let's go back to the flood, right? Peter says 8 souls were saved by water, right? Let's go to Moses. Moses was a lovely baby, and his parents put him in a basket and pushed him out into and the water carried him to Pharaoh's, right? And it saved him, right? Wasn't long, then let's go a little further. So we're fleeing the Egyptians. We come to the Red Sea. God parts the Red Sea, and the Red Sea saves the Israelites, doesn't it? Water saved them, didn't it? So then let's go a little further in the Bible. So they go across the Red Sea. They're saved on the other side of the Red Sea. They go into the wilderness. And what's most of this discussion? What gets Moses in trouble? Because he strikes the rock to give them what? Water. Because water is life, isn't it? We just read in John chapter 3, Jesus says you have to be born of the water and the Spirit, right? So the water in the Bible, the idea of water not only being what you need to survive, but the idea of water saving you is throughout the Bible. So it's not really an unusual thing when we talk about what Jesus talked about here. He said, I give you living. What's living water? Does anybody know? To a Jew, doesn't mean anything to me and you. Huh? Moving water. To a Jew, you couldn't be, even today, if you're a Jew and you're baptized into Judaism or you go through a mikveh, which is basically a Jewish baptism for cleansing, you has to be living water. This would not work for a Jew. Throw in that. Our baptismal would not work for a Jew because that's not living water. Okay? Now, I know they're sticklers for law, but if we stuck a big rain barrel up on the roof, and every time it rained, we caught a bunch of that rain, and we shot a little of that rainwater down in here, they would use it because that's living water. Where did Jesus baptize? Where did John baptize? Where did they go? The Jordan, right? They didn't go to a pond. I'm sure there were ponds, right? They didn't go to a pond. They went to a river because in Judaism, it has to be living water. And living water is either water that moves or rainwater. Those two things, that's living water. So when Jesus said, so a well in Judaism is not living water. Now there's a deeper meaning here, but you need to understand what that woman heard. What that woman heard was, I won't give you this stale water that's in this well. I won't give you this water that's been setting in the ground. I'll give you fresh, new, living, right? I mean, let's face it. If you ever took a glass of water, you go, well, that's sure fresh water. Water's water, isn't it? No. No, it's not, right? He says, I would give you this fresh, this living water. And so she said to him, you have nothing to draw with. The well is deep. Where do you get that living water? We always, when people talk to Jesus, whether it's Mary and Martha, it's kind of interesting because both cases I think about is Mary and Martha and then the woman at the well. But they both pose him this question, how would you do it? And we always think of God in terms that we understand, like how are you going to get the water? You got to have a bucket to get the water. It's kind of like Mary and Martha when they meet Jesus and he comes back and Lazarus is dead and they meet Jesus. They say, well, if you'd have been here, he hadn't died. Right? But now that he's dead, there's nothing you can do about it. It's like we always put these limitations on God. Of course, she didn't know who she was talking to. She didn't know it was Jesus. She just knew it was this guy that was talking to her at the well. So she didn't necessarily know who that was. And she says, you're not greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle. And Jesus answered and said, everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. And the woman said to him, sir, give me this water so I will not be thirsty, nor come all the way here to draw. So Jesus is talking very spiritually. She's talking very physically, as we would. She sees it in a physical sense, as I would see it, as you would see it. But Jesus is using this metaphorically and talking to her in a very spiritual idea. I'm going to give you this water. She doesn't understand who he is yet. We haven't got to that point in the story. So it's kind of the way that it starts, right? Are there any comments? And so he said to her, go call your husband. And she's honest. That's something you got to give her. She's an honest person. She says, I don't have a husband. And Jesus says, you've said that correctly, I have no husband. He says, for you've had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. This you have said truly. And she said, I perceive you're a prophet. So she starts to come to this understanding that, well, maybe you're a little more than just a guy sitting at the well. Kind of know who I am. You know what I've been about. And so Jesus, and then she says a real kind of an interesting statement because, okay, our fathers worshipped in this mountain, which is Ebal. Remember I showed you Ebal, and there's an altar on Ebal. And so the Samaritans worshipped on Ebal, okay? But God said you need to worship in Jerusalem. God said you need to worship at the temple. God commanded them to worship at the temple. But they worship on this altar on Gerizim, or Ebal. So they worship on this altar. And she says, our fathers worshipped in this mountain. She's talking about Ebal, okay? And you people say that in Jerusalem, you people, and you really got to look at what she's saying, because if you and I were having this conversation, right? You and I were having this conversation, and I said your people, you would kind of take offense at that a little bit, I would think. Or you would think, well, he doesn't really like us very well, because I made that distinction, right? Your people. Have you ever had a conversation, maybe it's in your own family, and you're there, and you say, that's your family. I mean, what are you saying, right? You're saying, I don't want nothing to do with them anymore. They're your family, all right? So when you make that distinction, and that's what she did. She said, it's your people. Your people. I always thought it's kind of a play, because in Exodus 33, 34, where Israel sins and build a golden calf, and Moses breaks the tablets, and God gets really angry with him. And he says, take the people, take your people you brought out of Egypt, right? I'm done with them. They're not my people anymore. They're yours now. You can have them. And I always thought it was kind of an interesting play when she says, your people. I don't know, it always kind of seemed funny to me. He says, you ought to worship in Jerusalem. And Jesus said, believe me, an hour is coming. This is really where we get into this. And I think it's important we understand the word worship here. And even if we go back, because it's one of those places where I'm telling you, every place here that we see the word worship is the word proskuneo. And without exception here. And that word means to fall down on your face, is to pay homage, to fall down with your face to the ground, to humble yourself before God, basically. And that's that word worship. So the word worship here is real specific. It's humbling yourself, falling down before God, face to the ground. That's the word that's used here. It's a word where we get the word to prostrate ourselves or to lay down, and it's exactly that same meaning. So all the way through this discourse, that word worship is that word, shakal in the Hebrew, and it's that word all the way through here. And Jesus said, "Believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain or Jerusalem will you worship the Father." So Jesus makes a statement. He says, he says, you don't know what you're doing here. But he says, but this is what's going to happen, and it's not going to matter where you worship anymore. It doesn't change the worship, doesn't change the word, doesn't change the meaning. But he says, guess what? You're not going to have to go to a specific place to do this. The hour's coming when you're not going to have to go to a specific place to worship God. And so it's a really huge statement, especially from Jesus. But Jesus also says, you worship what you do not know. Because Jesus understands that their worship, their idea of God is corrupted. Right? It's corrupted. And we saw that if you looked at Kings. It's been influenced by idol worship. It's been influenced by other cultures. It's been influenced by all these other things. And he understands that their worship is corrupted. And so Jesus also makes a distinction of the Samaritans. And he says, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. And that's kind of a play, because Samaritans technically are still kind of Jews, right? At least they're Israelites. But what Jesus really, I think, more saying here is from Judah. It's from what we would call the purest of the Jews that's left, which would be Judah. Salvation is from there. And that's important because he's from there. So he's making this statement to this. He said, but an hour is coming now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. Spirit's not capitalized, no definite article in the Greek. Doesn't say you're going to worship the Holy Spirit in truth. It says you're going to worship in your spirit. Okay? You're going to worship in spirit and truth. No definite article here, even translators agree. It's not capitalized. So it says you're going to worship in spirit and truth, your spirit and truth. For such people, the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. So he brings up the heart, right? Worship's more than the external. It's not about the place, not about the methodology, not about all these things anymore. It's about us, our heart, our spirit. So we can worship God wherever we're at, because worshiping is no longer about the place, the format. It's about worshiping with our spirit and our truth. So he really makes a huge statement to this woman, and it's really an interesting discourse. The woman said to him, I know the Messiah is coming. He who is called Christ. When that one comes, he will declare all things. And Jesus said, I who speak to you am he. And it's one of the few times in the Bible that Jesus reveals himself. And he reveals himself to this Samaritan woman. He wouldn't tell the Jews, he wouldn't tell the Pharisees, he wouldn't tell the scribes, wouldn't tell the leaders of the synagogue. They ask him all the time, are you the Christ? Right? He wouldn't even tell his apostles. He even asked them, he says, who do you say I am? He wouldn't even tell them who he was directly. But it was this woman, the Samaritan woman, that he says, I am he. It's me. I just think it's fascinating. Jesus revealed himself, right, to the one who, I don't know, put the word in there, I don't have the right word. He didn't reveal himself to the ones who you think he would reveal himself to. He revealed himself to the one who wasn't probably going to reveal him to anybody else that mattered. Isn't that interesting? And Jesus says, I'm he, right? I'm the one. I'm the one. And at this point, his disciples came, and they were amazed. It doesn't say they were amazed he was speaking with a Samaritan, although they were probably a little amazed about that too. But he says he's amazed he was speaking to a woman. And I just feel like I don't understand that culture, I guess, or that mindset. I was never raised that way. I don't think we understand maybe the significance of that. But obviously, it was a big thing, right? I mean, even if we don't totally understand that, and I don't understand that because I wasn't raised like that. It's not my culture. But you can tell it was a big thing, wasn't it, for him to be speaking to a woman in broad daylight, nonetheless, in a public place. And it's interesting. This culture still exists, isn't it? 2,000 years later, and this is the reality, isn't it? Over there still, isn't this the reality in a lot of the Middle East? I was reading an article the other day about Afghanistan and how they've even shut down the beauty salons now. And the women can't even do that now. That they've even closed that down. I was really interesting article. I was from a woman's perspective. You know, why would you care about going to a beauty salon? Because basically you have to cover yourself from head to toe anyway. But you know, to them it was important, and it was a big thing, and for their husbands it was a big thing where they could actually take off their whatever, you know, or whatever you call that. What a society! And yet here Jesus is speaking to this woman who's been married 5 times, right? And who's a Samaritan, and who's ashamed of herself. And Jesus is revealing to her things that he wouldn't even tell the most important people that lived that in those days, right? Wouldn't tell it to the most important people. But he revealed himself to this woman from Samaria. Out of time. Finish next week. Thanks for your time.